Welcome to the Spirit of Business, episode number 100, Looking Backwards or Looking Forwards, with Matt Murphy and Sarah McCrum.
Hi, Sarah.
Hi, Matt.
Well, we've got to 100 podcasts. So this is our 100th podcast today. So, a couple of years worth of work. So I feel pretty proud about the fact that we've managed to sort of have these conversations and record them on a weekly basis for that period of time. And we were just having a chat before this particular podcast to say, well, what's worthy of a topic? And I instantly went to reflection. Let's talk about, what we've been talking about for the last 100 episodes. And you said forward looking at the same time. So it was quite a funny moment where I was thinking back and you were thinking forward. And I said, well, maybe that's really a topic in itself, talking about reflection and forward at the same time. And then I think there's something in that where when we reflect or when we look forward, we do go back and forwards in our thought process, because when you're starting to think creatively and thinking about the future, I often start to get reference points about experience in the past to then work out, check in with what I'm thinking about in the future. Will it work? Won't it work? How's it going? How's it going to work? And then I often go back in reflection to work out, well, actually, I've had experience like this before. And do I draw upon that experience? But when I flip between forward and back, so to speak, being reflection, being back, it can sometimes stop me from moving forward because of going, oh, I've done that before and it didn't work. And you get into this sort of negative mindset. And so that was what was coming up for me when we were talking about forward and back. And so I thought it would be a good topic to talk about in terms of when we're looking forward and looking back. I think spending too much time forward is not necessarily, looking back is not healthy, and vice versa is equally not healthy. And I just thought I'd maybe get your thoughts around that sort of forward momentum and reflection at the same time.
Well, I was trained by Chinese masters, so I learned that old energy is it's kind of not really positive. That's why you don't feel very good when you look back. And I know people can look back on things they've done and make themselves feel good about it. I've never been good at that myself, but I said to you before, I'm an Aquarius, and so I think that I'm naturally more forward looking. That's the kind of person that I am. I think there's something really interesting, though, in how you can look at even where you are, for example, and use it as a springboard for looking forward, because it's easy to look forward in a way where you're not grounded. And then you get that kind of Pollyanna type of feeling of people just looking forward almost to escape from the present or to escape from the past. But I think it's a much bigger topic at the moment, because there are many people that I've met recently who are desperately trying to learn lessons from history in relation to the wider situation in the world. What can we learn from history so that we don't repeat it? And I don't know if I'm right or wrong about this, but I learned, because I married somebody from a very different culture, I learned that if you look to history, you can never unite. There's no way. Like, history always seems to divide us. And so my kind of personal philosophy, which I haven't tested at least any more than I have, is that it's the future that unites us. And so I have a really kind of committed direction towards a future that we are moving towards and shaping and influencing. So there's a really interesting contrast in starting points there.
And so when you're talking about looking forward and that looking back at history, there's a negative connotation, or it's divisive in the way that it sort of works. That's really interesting. And I bring that back to when you were talking, something that I do quite often, and maybe this is on a micro level rather than a macro level, which you were talking about, is that I never think about today. I never think about yesterday or what's actually occurred. I'm always, in business, especially 3 to 6 months ahead of myself. I'm always thinking about, what does the next 3 months look like? What does the next 6 months look like? I'm always forward thinking or forward looking. So it's like you hit a milestone or you achieve something, and I've already achieved it and banked it, and then I'm looking for the next thing and the next thing. So is there something in that micro management or micro status of a business owner, because I know often business owners do this as well, that they're already future thinking all the time because they need to be, to ensure that they stay up to date or evolve their businesses and look ahead, especially when it comes to cash and money as well. So is there anything in what you're saying there in terms of, from a business perspective, and getting the balance right? Because I don't think I've got the balance right a lot of the time, with always being forward looking and not necessarily being historic or present in the moment.
It's probably not true that you're always forward looking, because you always talk about how when you go into other people's businesses, you look at where they are and how they've been performing in order to figure out what's going to happen in the future. So I'm sure you do that with your own business. But if you think about it, it wouldn't really make sense to grow your business backward looking. Like you'd go backwards in the end, wouldn't you? So for me, I think that life is like that. We don't walk backwards, we walk forwards. But perhaps the thing that's more interesting in that for me is that you're very good probably at that more masculine part of it. What I'm missing is the bit that probably I'm good at. I'm not so good at that bit that you do, but I know that I'm good at the sensing into the future. So when I'm looking forward, I'm not looking at the performance so much. I'm looking at what does it feel like. And that for me, the performance, if it's feeling good, the performance is included within that. So I'm always working on the energy of it, or the feeling, the kind of feeling or the sensing into it, into the direction forward. I'm not so performance driven as you are.
So how do you, in that situation, how do you feel? I can feel in the present. Okay. How do you feel in the future?
Well, that's exactly the point. If what I feel in the present, which is in relation to the future, everything gets shaped here. We don't have any influence except in the present. Mm-hmm. And if I look towards the future and I feel like, oh God, that's awful, that doesn't feel good, I'm already influencing the playing out of the future to be disappointing or to not feel good. So if I can look towards the future and have I think of it as kind of like almost bringing the future into the present and then sensing what it's like. And from there, that's what influences a much better future. But very often we compromise our picture of the future or our sense of the future with all the negative thoughts that we can have. And then it's really not surprising that those negative thoughts tend to play out.
And those negative thoughts, do you find, not for you, but for the people that you often mentor and coach around this particular thing, do you find that those negative thoughts are coming from past experiences and the reflection bit that's shaping the feeling towards the future?
Yes, always. We always look to our past experience to understand and interpret what's going on and what might go on in the future. And the future is nothing like the past. It's always evolving. It's always different. The energy is always new. But if we constantly reference the past, then we tend to repeat patterns over and over again, because we pick up energy from the past, kind of roll it through us instead of really operating on the new energy. So it makes a much more repetitive pattern. Whereas if you don't do that so much, like, it's not about ignoring the lessons of the past. I think it's actually about knowing that whatever you learned from the past, you've learned. You can trust that you've learned that. So face forward with all the knowledge and experience that you have. That's how I see it. It's
So how do you do it in that regard? Like, how do you actually make sure that you don't spend, because what I sense is what you just said then is that you can spend too much time, like we said at the start, in the past, which shapes the future. Okay. And then you don't want to spend all your time in the future without thinking about, the lessons and the knowledge and the experience that you've learned in the past. So how do you actually make sure that you balance that so you've got a feel into the future like you're talking about, so there's a positive experience?
Well, I don't think you need to kind of remember the lessons you've learned in the past, because you've learned them. Like, if you had an experience, I had the experience, for the best example I have in my life is going out of business and not being able to pay the rent on the flat that I was living in. in London. And after I had that experience, it was really clear that I was never going to have it again, because I didn't ever want to go back there. I didn't need to keep saying, oh, I learned that lesson from the past. I needed to say, I'm always going to pay my rent. So it was actually always a forward-looking thing, because I'd learned the lesson already. So if you've learned something, you've learned it. And if you haven't learned it, you haven't learned it anyway. So it's kind of like, what you haven't learned, you haven't learned, and you will probably learn at some point. So I really trust, and I see in people that when they have a difficult experience, if they have some time, if they have some awareness around it, like many people have experiences where they have no awareness of what's going on. But if we have some awareness, we're a little bit awake around it, I don't think we need to keep revisiting it. I think we need to really know that we've learned that, and that if something comes up that seems similar, it's not going to be the same thing. It's going to be something new, because once you've learned something, you've learned it. It doesn't go away from you.
I liked what you just said then, around, it was kind of a positive affirmation to a negative one. You said that, that you were in a situation where you couldn't pay your rent, and you said, I'm always going to be able to pay my rent. So therefore you went from I'd never want to not be able to pay my rent ever again sort of type thing, which is a negative sort of type statement, to one saying, I'm always going to be in a position where I can pay my rent. So therefore it becomes...
It was, in a way, it was kind of like, that's my bottom line, my basic standard. Paying rent is a non-negotiable from now on.
Mm. And so therefore it feels like there's a lot more forward-looking positive energy to that particular statement, just even in that small statement then in isolation. We can use an example. I can see that as an example to get a sense that, how we can take that past experience, almost like put the positive affirmation around it, and then it's kind of parked in the brain, which means you don't have to, as you say, go back and revisit it, because you've learned it, you've learned the lesson, you've got the positive affirmation that comes from that, or positive statement, and then you can just move forward from that, rather than having to dwell on that, oh, that was terrible, I couldn't pay my rent, and and go back into that past experience again constantly.
Which is what people do. Yes, for me, it's a decision. There's a decision that gets made, and it's really important to make those kinds of decisions. If you don't want to experience something again, make a decision about who you're going to be instead. Very, very decisive. It's like the commitment is included in the decision. And that's extremely powerful. I mean, I've sat with people who have been crying and saying, I'm really afraid that I'm going to end up living in this awful place. And they have some reference point in their mind, which is entirely from the past. And I've met them years later, and they've said, this happened to me recently. Somebody said, do you remember that time when I was sitting in front of you and I was crying? This big guy, totally capable guy. I was crying because I thought I was going to end up living in this awful place in Brisbane. And he was reflecting, it was because he'd not been able to pay his mortgage. So they hadn't paid their mortgage for more than a year. So they were in a difficult situation, but he just was laughing. He said, you said to me, that's not true. It's not true. And he said, it wasn't true. It was never true. It was just some idea that I had in my mind that made me cry, made me feel sorry for myself. But in fact, it wasn't true, even though he'd completely lost it with his mortgage. But they sorted things out, and they moved on, and they're living a very good life now.
Yeah, it's funny, I think about the loop that you go in, unless you make that decision to break the loop, so to speak, because it just goes around and around, as you say, and thinking that's what's going to occur, and it continues on, unless you make that definitive sort of statement to break that loop. That's the decision you're talking about, because if you don't do it, that's when you end up, keep repeating yourself over and over again, which is living life in the past, as opposed to saying, well, no, I'm making a clear decision today that that's not the way I'm going to be living in the future. Because that isn't the truth. It's just a story that we tell ourselves because we've seen it happen to other people, so we expect that that's what could possibly happen to us.
Yeah, so we're already in some kind of loop, and we just keep running on it. So it's like, oh, the same thing's going to happen over and over again. And the power of a decision like that, I think it's hard to realize when you're in the loop how powerful it is to make a decision, because you feel like you're caught in this loop. And so there's a powerlessness associated with that. And the power to just make a decision, you don't actually have to, it's like we think we've got to achieve the decision before we make it, but actually we have to make the decision and then we can achieve it. And when you make a decision with great clarity, it's not nearly so hard to achieve it. That's what I've experienced.
Yeah, but it's such an easy thing to say on this podcast to do that, but it's just such a hard thing to do. And I experience it, and I still experience it, to go, I can make a decision not to do it, or I can stay in the loop, in the pattern. And it can just, it's very, because our minds are so powerful, and we can actually sometimes not be able to break some of those patterns or those loops, and just go, you know what, that's not the truth, that's the past, that's an experience that I don't have to repeat, or that's not my experience. And logically, it all makes sense logically, doesn't it? But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's an easy transition. You know, that big guy that's, you know, that spoke to you, you know, I'm sure he's very logical and practical in a way that he probably operates his life in many other ways, but to actually go through it, it's just the power of the mind is just quite phenomenal. And it's debilitating for a lot of people too.
Well, I think we have so overemphasized the mind that we've made our minds have a kind of dominion that they're really not fit for. And so it's not just that the mind is really we've let the mind become really powerful, but we've given it a power that it's not capable of fulfilling. And so that's why we get thoughts that go round and round in circles, because it's like we're trying to use the wrong bit of our makeup to do something. The mind is not the place to be doing that at all. But when you give it so much power, it's like trying to, I don't know, smell something with your ear. And if you think, like, I've really got to smell it with my ear, and you just try and try and try and try, and however hard you try, you can't smell it with your ear, because your ear was not designed for smelling things. I think the mind is a bit like that. We just try and try and try to make the mind lead and decide and do all of these things in our life. And that's not where it comes from. So it's exhausting. And we live in an environment where everybody's doing that, and where we're educated to do that. Like, the whole system is based on a misunderstanding, in my view, of what the mind is actually fit for. And I'm not the only person who thinks that, by the way. It's not entirely
exactly right.
Sarah McCrum.
And the thing that you've taught me a lot over the years, and our practice, but I still have to be reminded to do it constantly too, because of the power of the mind sometimes, is to really get out of your mind, okay, and drop down into more of your heart space, more of your soul, more of that sort of the sense of your being and who you are, and that it isn't your mind that's actually controlling you. So that's often, once again, a very liberating way of living, but sometimes a difficult thing to do.
Yeah. Well, if you look back to the topic that we started with, the mind is always either engaged with the past or the future. When we're in the present, really in the present, the mind gets very quiet, because there's really not much for it to do at all. But it's constantly churning. If it's churning about the past, it tends to be just repeating. If it's churning about the future, it's usually basing the future on the past. So actually the mind is full of all the old stuff. It's full of all our memories and experiences that have been processed. It's not the real experience itself, but just fragments of experiences. In my language, we think of it as old energy. It's like garbage, basically. And the times of brilliance that we have and inspiration, the mind is involved, but it's not leading the show. So maybe you have a brilliant idea, and then you can write it down and you can put it in words and do things with it, and the mind is involved with that. But the mind isn't responsible for the brilliance. It's more like it interprets the brilliance, and that to me puts the mind in the right place. And then it gives us peace as well, because we're not constantly predicting the future based on the past, which is, the future is not the past, so it's just not the place to predict it from. It doesn't work like that.
Yeah, and there's also spending too much time in other place with the wrong mindset. I often hear the statement that if you spend too much time reflecting upon the past, that's where depression lives. And if you spend too much time thinking about the future, and that's where anxiety lives. And then so therefore that's the concept of being present is really the place of peace, as you say, and a place that you can start to make some great decisions, and really the mind becomes a vessel, or the body becomes a vessel associated with making those, being present enough to sort of get that sense of brilliance.
Yeah, and there is a way that you can do that in relation to the future. So you can do it in a forward-looking way. So often those moments of brilliance are like, oh, wow, how amazing it would be if I did this, for example. You get an idea, which is always something about the future. It's not something you're going to do in the past. So it actually really works with what we're talking about facing forward. Like I definitely, I know I've said this before on the podcast, when I've walked a lot, I like to look behind every now and then, because it's a very good reference point. And I find that in my life, it's really helpful to look and see, oh, wow, 6 months ago, it feels like I was in the same place as I am, but actually look what's happened in the last 6 months. I'm one of those people for whom always a lot more has happened than I remember on the surface, if you see what I mean. So I find that that's useful, but just as a kind of, oh, well, that's really good. Let's keep going then kind of thing. Like, this is really worth it.
Well, it creates that momentum, or creates that sort of reference point, as you say, to say, yes, I'm on the right track. Because if you look back and you say, okay, that was a path that I took and I could see the path. Yes, I like that path and I want to continue on with that path, rather than sort of stopping and just looking back and just looking at that path for a long period of time, if you know what I mean. So it's a reference point to then be able to go forward, as you say.
Yeah, and for me now, I really remember the experience, why it was so valuable, because I do that most if I've just walked up, for example, somewhere that's really steep. Or in the first, I remember when I used to walk a lot on mountains, the first hour or so is usually the toughest, because you're not fully warmed up yet. And I remember, I'd walk up somewhere steep for 10 or 15 minutes, and it would feel like half an hour or 3/4 of an hour, or you feel like, oh, I'm not really getting very far because this is steep and it's slow. And you look back and it's like, oh my goodness, I've come so far so quickly. I had no idea. So it's that feeling that in the moment, life can feel hard. It can feel tiring sometimes, demanding. You feel like, oh, I don't think I'm making much progress. But then I look back, it's like, wow, actually, although when I was in it, it didn't really feel like it. Look at all the progress that has been made here. I think it's really good for the times when everything feels quite challenging and slow.
I agree. And that's the probably what I was reflecting on before, and maybe I'm not articulating very well, is that sense of stopping and looking and celebrating. Okay, so you're celebrating where you've come to, celebrate the fact that you're now in your situation of walking. You can look around and there's a great view to look at, and because you've actually walked up that steep part of the hill. In business, it's celebrating the fact that you've been able to achieve some things that you set out to achieve. When you went into business in the first place, that you're able to say, hey, I did go out into business, like we've spoken about many, many times, of all the things, and go, actually, I am closer to where I want to get to. I'm not there yet, but I'm closer to where I want to get to. I've been on this pathway, and yeah, there's probably times where I've worked out that maybe it's not the right pathway and we've adjusted, but this is this important bit, because and this is what I had to remind myself for many years, is that I never looked back to reflect, to see the view. And now that's a great thing to do, because it shows that you get some sort of sense of satisfaction that you're on the right pathway. It means you can still be present in that moment too, to celebrate that particular point, but not for too long is the other thing that I'm very conscious of.
Yeah, for me, it really is about the change in the view. I think that that's the case in business as well. It's like, because there's a feeling and also that goes with that. It's like, wow, a year ago, I couldn't do this. I couldn't see all the things that I can see now. I couldn't experience the things that I'm experiencing now. So there's a sense of gaining competence, but it's not just competence, it's experience. It's really experience. I guess I feel, especially in relation to the world today, that things that we might see up ahead are so unpredictable. Like I think it's a very, very difficult world to say, this is what I want to achieve. I want to achieve, like I can imagine somebody saying, I want to achieve some kind of exit out of my business, and having no idea that COVID was going to come along and they were actually going to be exited out of their business overnight because their state locked down and their business was closed for a year, kind of thing. It's like we couldn't, there are so many unpredictables in the world. There always have been, but I think it's in business terms, it's particularly the case at the moment. So it's like, for me, it's how can I have that sense of growing, like life is growing with me, I'm growing with it, I'm growing in a direction, I know what I really care about and what I want to create and what I want to contribute, and keep that flexibility of outcome, because the circumstances can change so fast.
I think that's a really important point to make, is that we can't predict the future. We can't predict what's going to happen. We have to continually stay present to the fact of change is going to occur, and remain nimble enough to be able to take advantage of whatever circumstances get presented to us as well. And you can't always look for history to determine the future, as we've discussed, or to give us the pathway forward, because as you said before, it's always evolving, it's always new. We've never really been in the same situation before, even though with pandemics, yes, they've occurred over the centuries, but they've never occurred in 2022. And we live in a 2022, which is a very different place than living back in 1922, for example, and so from that point of view, we think, oh, well, okay, we'll just go back and look, remember what happened then. Well, no, that was when, we're in the industrial, coming into the industrial age sort of type thing. So it's completely different. We're in the technological age nowadays. The fact that we can sit here and still do what we're doing and having these meetings means that, you can't predict, well, okay, that was what the history was, because it's completely different. And I think it's really important to reflect on that and say, well, yes, we can't predict it. We have to stay open. We have to stay present. We have to stay nimble. It doesn't mean we don't plan and we don't sort of feel it, like you talk about, feel into the future, but we just have to get that balance right, is kind of what I feel.
Yeah, I was in a meeting a couple of days ago with a very, very experienced, let's say, financial commentator and analyst. Analyst sounds far too narrow for what he is. But it was interesting listening to him, because he was saying there were things that are happening now that he has never seen happen he's very interested in history and the history of finance and all of that. He said, I've never seen anything like this before. And so I picture somebody who has this picture about what's going to happen when they sell their business, and like, really, do we have any idea whether that's going to happen at all? Do we have any idea where the systems are going to be, how money is going to be? He was talking about the changes in money that he's expecting to happen, that are so extreme that probably are very difficult for us to relate to in a way. So I think it's a really extra interesting time from that perspective, because it means we have to fall back much more on our human skill and our ability to be here, our ability to be alive, our ability to live, rather than our ability to control our circumstances.
Oh, that's the big C word, control. And in terms of, the control is something that is, especially with business owners, I find too, that we like to control things. One of the reasons why a lot of business owners go into business is this aspect of controlling their life and their future from that point of view, rather than being in a paid employment. And we believe that we've got more control in businesses than we do if we're employed. That's a fallacy, by the way. We know that because we can control certain aspects of it, but really we can't.
Just think for a moment, if you're an employee, you're in an uncontrollable position in relation to somebody who's not able to control his business or her business. So you've got double lack of control. I wouldn't want that.
And so, well, that's true as well. So, from that point of view, but there's probably more tied up in it when you're in business, because it's hard to just go, I'll just change jobs. It's very difficult to just change business, so to speak. But this element of control, like you're talking about, is that's probably the other Achilles heel, because we think we can control things, but we really can't at the end of the day, as we know, because we just don't know what's going to happen. Nobody predicted what we've just experienced for the last 2 years. I think there's some people that did, obviously, but for the general person, didn't predict that was going to happen to their businesses and didn't plan for it, and so therefore found themselves in situations that they're going, what do I do now? And I think that staying present, being nimble, being able to create flow, to be able to then go and do something about it is really, really important.
And to be able to connect with people and listen to people. Like, at least I feel always, it doesn't really matter. I know that if I had to, I could start another business. I could find a way to offer something to be useful to people. I always have felt confident about that. So yeah, to me, these are the human skills that are far more important. And it is interesting. I get the sense that a lot of people are looking at that much more. They're looking much more at the real skills and the real qualities of life, rather than the quite artificial ones that we have tended to prioritize a lot. So there is a shift going on there.
I think there's a massive shift going on, as we've discussed, and that's why it's so important to, I think, for this topic, and as you said, quite rightly said, is that being present and being able to feel into the future is so important, more so now than ever before, because of the great sense of uncertainty.
Yes, and perhaps then it becomes important to be able to be present, simply so that you can handle that level of uncertainty. I think many people probably really, if we could look inside what's going on with them, we'd either see that level of uncertainty is very, very, very uncomfortable, or maybe that a lot of people are cutting themselves off from it so they don't feel it. I was wondering about that earlier today. It's just like, what would it be like to be in somebody else's situation, perhaps who hasn't had much education about how to manage the really human aspects of life, how to manage. Now, some people are amazing. There are always people who just really come out in a difficult situation and they're incredibly strong. I was just wondering, what would it be like not to have any of those skills? And then I thought, well, maybe I would just cut off from the confusion and the discomfort and all of that. It's an interesting thing to think about.
It is indeed. I wouldn't mind just spending a moment just talking about the fact that, we are at sort of 100 podcasts, as we discussed, and it is a spirit of business. And we sort of had this idea, a couple of years ago. We said it'd be great to have a podcast and put together your, the way that you've been educated and think about the world, and the way that I've been educated and think about the world, and come together to help solve business problems, really, from different angles. And that's kind of been the theme for the last couple of years. And I think that we're kind of at the stage, and we discussed this, that it might be well worth us having a bit of a break from doing the podcast, from which we will do it. But I wouldn't mind reflecting from your point of view, what's kind of the message that you'd really like to leave with the listeners, that we, the theme that we've had for the last, I know I'm putting you on the spot, by the way, but just something that you go, if you could impart one piece of knowledge or experience, or the thing that keeps coming up for you over and over again, for the years that we've been doing this, and also for the time that you spend, because you spend so much time in this particular space dealing with people, dealing with these particular things. What is it that's that overriding message that you'd like to sort of leave our listeners for a period of time?
I actually always come back to the name of the podcast. There's something about the name of it, the spirit of business, which for me sums up everything. I feel that if we can keep our spirit in business, whatever we're doing, and however the business is going, and it can be going up and it can be going down, you can be starting, ending, can be ending with a flourish or ending rather sadly. It doesn't really matter. But if we can keep that spirit, our personal spirit, and there's some sense of the spirit of business itself. Business is the way that we contribute our gifts to other people in the world. It's an act of generosity that is or can be generously rewarded. So to me, that's the essence of it. That's the thing that I feel can keep us going through all different situations. It's what grows great businesses rather than mediocre businesses. It's what grows great people rather than people who are just maybe compromising. It's what enables us to build and grow businesses based around values and things that we believe in and things that we really care about. So yeah, the spirit of business says it all for me.
And it does for me. And while you were talking, and I was reflecting at the same time and thinking, when you know, with spirit, the word strength always comes out. When I think about great spirit, I think of great strength that goes along with it. And I think it takes a great amount of strength to be able to create a business, go into business, and then actually remain in business for a period of time and deal with all of the complexity associated with it. And it takes such spirit and endeavor to being able to do all those particular things to get to where you want to get to. And then I love the fact that the word spirit has the connotation around something, an energy. It's something beyond, you know, what you can touch and feel. It has sort of an abstract to it. And a lot of what we talk about, and a lot of what you talk about, is this, you know, this sense of self. And we were talking about it even today around sort of getting out of your mind and more into your heart and your soul, which is a spirit basis for me as well. And so, you know, all that together is so powerful. But if we lose sight of that spirit and we lose sight of being in our heads and only being in our heads and not sort of in our heart and soul, that's when it becomes, I think business becomes very, very difficult. And so for me, it's remembering that what we're doing is an endeavor, there's a strength, but to constantly get out of your head and get into yourself. So you can ride that resilience, and you can actually ride the business and the complexity associated with it. There's something in that for me that really resonates and helps to move things forward. And probably the overriding sense for me constantly, because I deal with business owners all day, every day, and obviously, you know, we've discussed that, and I am one, is that just be kind to yourself and nurture yourself through this whole thing too. And feed that soul and the heart, and not constantly be in your head and worrying about the next thing or the future, and be present and enjoy what you've achieved and the fruits of your labor and the successes that you had, and laugh at the failures and move on from it, sort of type thing. So that's kind of the sense that I get about business. The wonderful and rich conversations that we've had over the last couple of years has been, I've enjoyed every one of them. And every time we've had a conversation, there's always been that moment, I think, where we've just gone, oh, actually, that's kind of, that's what that means. That's why we came up with this topic in the first place. And that's been fantastic. And I just want to thank you too, Sarah, because I've really enjoyed this time together with you, being able to explore these concepts and thoughts and come from different angles to be able to not always solve the thing, but at least give people, hopefully, you know, a thought process so they can maybe get on track to solve some of the issues that they've got in their business. So I think it's been wonderful.
And so often it's been something where it wasn't really about solving something, but there was just some kind of breakthrough that makes the thing go away. I was in a really interesting meeting this week. It was a very high level meeting about money. So therefore, really centrally about business. It was about the future of the economy and the future of money. And we had somebody there who was kind of witnessing the meeting and taking notes and looking for the most resonant, most significant things that were said in the meeting. And he summed up at the end. And it's really interesting, actually, because the most resonant or the most powerful thing that was said in the whole meeting was effectively the same as what we're talking about, the spirit of business. It was actually talking, the words that we used were something like bringing divinity back into money, not in a religious sense, but it's actually the same thing that we're talking about. It's allowing business and money and the economy to be associated with spirit at the same time, that there is something bigger, and that produces values and meaning and purpose within our activities, and that is the key to the future of business, to the future of the economy, therefore to the future of governance, organization of human beings on this planet, which in many ways then becomes the key to the future of our life. So it feels really relevant in this week where I was in that meeting to have this conversation, like that spirit of business, that sums it up, the combination, the material aspect of business, and then this intangible, mysterious part of life that we can never control and never hold on to, but plays out all the time in everything. Bringing that together will make things work.
And that provides a significant amount of hope for a lot of people too, because I think sometimes we can get in a place of lack of hope or hopelessness. And so to know that if you can do these things, it can provide such great hope. And that is something that's really important and needed at this particular point in time, especially in times of uncertainty and change. One of the things that I'm conscious of is that, you know, as I just discussed before, that we're going to take a break from these podcasts for a period of time. And I'm sure we'll be back at some form in the future somehow. But in the meantime, I'm very conscious that, you know, we've got a band of listeners, a following of people that have actually, you know, have listened to us for the last couple of years, and we've been very, you know, we've had wonderful feedback, and that's provided the momentum to keep going. And one of the things that I'm conscious of is that I'd hate to think that, you know, we've finished today and we never get to engage with any of our listeners ever again. So that would sort of not make me feel very good from that point of view. So, you know, I'd like to invite people to that are listening, that are interested in what we've been talking about, to really engage with, especially the work that Sarah does around this particular space, because it's such a rich amount of content and knowledge and experience and wisdom that especially she has with her, you know, the things that she offers. And so I really encourage everybody to you know, really engage with that if they've really enjoyed this particular process, the podcasts, the experience that they've had. You know, we don't want to just sort of end it there and not sort of have anything for people to be able to go on to. And I'd really like people to consider that if they're not already, you know, in that particular ecosystem of Sarah, because you know, we want to help business. Sarah and I are both built really fundamentally to help people and business owners, and that's what we're here to do. And the more that we can do that to help people, that's the thing that fills my heart, and that's the thing that provides that spirit for me, and why we continue on doing what we're doing. So I'd love it if, you know, we got people we could help more and more people. Really, is that's our impact for the world.
Yeah, and which is not to say that Matt doesn't have the wisdom. He's talking all about me. It's just that I have the I have the system set up and the courses and the things like that enable you to move on and do something. So if you are interested in developing that spirit of business, developing that kind of combination of very grounded and practical material stuff that business is on a day-to-day basis, with this more intangible and more this kind of sense of purpose and all the other things that we've talked about, there are a couple of really obvious places to go, which everything's on my website, which is sarahmccrum.com. And one of them is I have a program that's called Thank You Money. And it's fundamentally about your relationship with money, but it's also your relationship with yourself and your relationship with life and purpose and the deeper aspects of yourself. So to me, it's what sits at the heart of any business, because money sits right in the center of a business. But the way we tend to see money can be limiting and doesn't often feel very satisfying. So in Thank You Money, you can find a relationship with money really similar to the way we're talking about the spirit of business, that actually feels good. And then when you can feel good about money, you can relax about it. And then that's a whole different thing. And I also have a program called The Leading Edge, which is a more advanced program, but it is about being really on the leading edge of our life. We're in a very leading edge situation at the moment in the world. Like we're very much on the edge of the unknown. We don't know what's happening, and we know that we don't know. We can't really pretend that we know these days. So the leading edge is really developing the skills of being right out on the edge there. The way I see it, it's the skills of liberation of the spirit. Actually, that's the essence of the work that I do, is to liberate our spirit so we can do business, so we can do the things with each other that we are made to do. And all of that ultimately comes through the form of business in some form or other. So yeah, sarahmccrum.com is the place to go.
And given the fact that, I've worked with Sarah for many, many years, and why, encouraged me to do this and why we've been doing this together is because of that body of work that I fundamentally believe in as well, as part of what we do as a collective. And it's supported and helped so many people over the years, and to provide guidance and really for the benefit of a better life fundamentally for people. And so I think it's fantastic, and really commend you for it, Sarah, because I know how many people you've helped over the years and supported, and how many businesses that's been the case. And I think it's wonderful. And yes, I do it in my job and my role from that point of view as well, and in terms of businesses and the community that I support too. So it's been, as I said, a fantastic experience, one that I will always treasure, and I know that it won't end here because we get to speak with each other every day fundamentally anyway. So but just wanted to really acknowledge the body of work that you've done, how good it is, and really encourage people to really engage with it if they haven't engaged with it before.
Thank you, Matt, and thank you. This was a genuine partnership, making these recordings, and it's been a very interesting experience to see how life kind of resolves itself time and time and time again. We bring along something where perhaps we're not sure about it, and through conversation it finds its way. It's one of those beautiful little examples to me of life in action.
Well, thank you very much, Sarah. I very much enjoyed it.
You've been listening to The Spirit of Business with Matt Murphy and Sarah McCrum. If you'd like some insight into the spirit in which you do business, a great place to start is by looking at your relationship with money. Find out more by taking the Money Scorecard at moneyscorecard.app, and we'll be back next week.